If you want to hear my thoughts about Dan Campbell's bizarre coaching at the end of the first half of the NFC Championship, then head over to JJ9 News now, where we talk all things NFL all the time. New videos drop daily about the happenings in the league. And now, on with our feature presentation. One of the biggest things that people do at the Super Bowl, by far, is bet on the specific stats that players will incur. These are known as prop bets. You can do prop bets on just about anything. How many yards Patrick Mahomes will throw for in the first quarter? How many rushing yards Christian McCaffrey will have in the third quarter? Whether Justin Watson has more than 2 catches? Whether Chris Conley has a target? You can bet on, quite literally, anything and everything. And because of that, it's important that all the stats given during the game are completely 100% accurate. Even the slightest bit of variation in the yardage, and even the slightest miscalculation, will screw everything up. As of this video, the over-under on Patrick Mahomes and his passing yards at Super Bowl 58 is 260.5. So if you bet the over, you have to hope he throws for at least 261. So imagine a scenario where Mahomes throws for 263, but 6 hours after the game, the NFL issues a stat correction and says that one of those passes that went for 5 yards was, in fact, a backwards pass. So it should be a run, and Mahomes' number is knocked down to 258. A mistake like that would be, well, catastrophic for a lot of people, and understandably so. You cannot make mistakes with the stats at the Super Bowl, where only the day after the game when you wake up do you realize if the numbers were off the entire time. Well, at this game right here, Super Bowl 9, that's exactly what happened. This Super Bowl featured a ton of bizarre stories. There was the fact that this game was played at Tulane Stadium because the Superdome was supposed to host, but the stadium was not ready in time, hence why we have the rule today that states that no stadium can host in its first season. That will definitely be a video for a future date. There was the fact that maybe the best defensive player of the game was Steelers defensive end Dwight White, who played after almost dying in a hospital bed just a few days before. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. There was the fact that the Steelers changed their shoes at halftime because they couldn't get the proper footing beforehand, and didn't know how to handle a Tulane Stadium field. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And there was the bizarre fact that the NFL had a hungry heart and tried to get Bruce Springsteen to play the halftime show, tried to get the Jersey Rocker before his glory days and rise to superstardom. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And there's this bizarre story that we're going to talk about today that you might not know about. Because at Super Bowl 9, as it turns out, the statisticians got a key stat wrong. And only hours after the game did anyone realize that the calculations were off. And this is the story behind one of the craziest statistical mistakes in Super Bowl history, and the drama that ensued at Super Bowl 9. Before I talk about the actual mistake in question, we need some context to understand how the game was going, and the two teams playing in it. It's January 12, 1975, and we're down at Tulane Stadium in New Orleans for Super Bowl 9 between the Pittsburgh Steelers out of the AFC and the Minnesota Vikings out of the NFC. One of these teams is going to make a ton of history by the end of the day, and I don't just mean the fact that they'll be crowned world champions and get to hoist the coveted Vince Lombardi trophy. Neither the Steelers nor the Vikings had ever won the Super Bowl before. For Pittsburgh, this was their first appearance in the big game, but for Minnesota, this was their third attempt, after the last two fell short at Super Bowl 4 and Super Bowl 8, and you can learn more about their loss in the Super Bowl the previous year by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Someone is walking away as a world champion for the first time ever by the end of this cold, chilly day in one of the coldest Super Bowls on record. Now, a big reason why the Vikings got to this spot was because of this element of their game right here, their ground game. Sure, the Vikings had Franz Harkington, a Pro Bowl quarterback who ended that season with the most passing yards in the conference and the second most passing touchdowns in the conference. He was a huge part as to why the Vikings finished 5th in the league in points scored and 3rd in total yards. But they also had a great ground game, led by guys like Oscar Reed, Dave Osborne, and of course, Pro Bowl running back Chuck Foreman, who led the league with 15 touchdowns from scrimmage and was 4th in the league in yards from scrimmage at 1,363. Over Minnesota's final 4 games entering the Super Bowl, they amassed 625 rushing yards, or well over 156 yards per game, which was well above the league-wide average of 133 yards per game. In their playoff win against the Cardinals in the divisional round, which they won 30-14, in a game that you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, they won based on the strength of their ground game, which had 199 yards on nearly 5 yards per carry. The leading rusher on the Cardinals was Terry Metcalf, who had 55 yards. Minnesota had two guys surpass that, with Dave Osborne running for 67 and Chuck Foreman running for 114. And they followed that up by running for 164 yards in the NFC Championship against the Los Angeles Rams in their 14-10 win in that game. Once again, having two guys in Chuck Foreman and Dave Osborne run for over 75 yards, which was more than the top dog on the Rams had. Few teams were better at running the football at this juncture in the season than the Vikings were. And if the Vikings were going to win this game and win the title, then they would need to keep that momentum up. Which is what made this battle so exciting and intriguing on paper, because the Vikings were going up against this run defense right here, as in the Pittsburgh Steelers, who maybe had the best rushing defense in the league. The Steelers allowed fewer yards than any team in football, and allowed the second fewest points of any team in football, allowing just 189 points, or 13.5 points per game. The only team better than that was the Los Angeles Rams, who were just 8 points better. And a big reason why the Steelers had such a great defense was because of their rushing defense, which finished 6th in the league in rushing yards allowed, 2nd in rushing touchdowns allowed, and 4th in yards per carry allowed. At a time when it was the norm for teams to run for well over 100 yards a game, in their final 9 games before the Super Bowl, the Steelers held their opponent to under 100 in 6 of them, including their most recent outing in the AFC Championship against the Oakland Raiders, where in a 24-13 victory, they held the Raiders to 29 rushing yards. That's it. The Raiders were 3rd in the league in rushing yards, and the Steelers held them to 29 yards on 21 carries, just completely destroying them in that facet of the game. With a stacked front 7 across the board with L.C. Greenwood, Joe Green, Ernie Holmes, Dwight White, Jack Ham, Jack Lambert, and Andy Russell, a lot of those guys being Hall of Famers, it's not hard to see why teams had trouble running on Pittsburgh. They were the steel curtain for a reason. Super Bowl IX was a battle between the unstoppable force in Minnesota's ground game and the immovable object in Pittsburgh's run defense. And on this day, as you're able to tell, oh man, did one side win in a landslide. Fun fact, when Fleetwood Mac released their song Landslide later that year, the title was inspired by the margin that the Steelers' run defense destroyed the Vikings' ground game. Because the big reason why the Steelers won the game 16-6 to win their first Super Bowl in franchise history was because the Vikings got absolutely nothing going on the ground. Chuck Foreman had one run that went for 12 yards, which was his longest run of the day. The second longest run by a Viking was 4 yards. For the most part, every single rushing attempt for the Vikings went for a loss of yards, or at most, went for 1 yard. The Vikings had 7 carries in the second half, and on those 7 carries, 4 of them went for a loss of yards, while a 5th went for no gain. The second longest run of the second half for the Vikings was when Dave Osborne picked up 1 yard. It was that kind of day, where the Vikings were completely held in check on the ground. Pro Bowler Chuck Foreman had 22 yards on 12 carries, and Dave Osborne had -1 yard on 8 carries, meaning that everyone watching the game had more rushing yards than Osborne did on this day. The final total after the game for the Vikings, 21 yards on 20 carries, or barely over 1 yard per carry. That's what the stats said. That's what was recorded. And that's what many newspapers ran with. Because why wouldn't they? Those were the official stats coming from the official statisticians of the NFL. And here's the crazy part. There was no reason to question any of this. There were no such things as prop bets back then. The first prop bet wasn't until Super Bowl 20. So from a Vegas gambling perspective, this number meant nothing. Even if there was a prop bet for rushing yards, the number would not have been that low to the point where it would have mattered. No matter what the number would have been if it happened today, the under would have cashed in fairly easily. And it's not as though the Steelers were anywhere close to a record for fewest rushing yards allowed in a Super Bowl. They had thoroughly smashed that record. They were number 1 and there was no close second. Here's a look at the first 9 Super Bowls and the rushing yards allowed by each of the 18 teams in those games according to the original stats. The Steelers are first by a comfortable margin, so regardless of if the number got adjusted or not, they would still be in first place and would have etched their name in the record book that way. And it's not like anything looked off about the stats in the slightest bit. The stats indicated that the Steelers were dominant against the run, probably allowing a yard per carry when you factor in Foreman's one fluke run of 12 yards and all the negative runs balancing each other out. And the eye test indicated the same thing. In other words, this could have been the final thing, and this could have been the end of it, and no one would have batted an eye or thought twice about it. Except there was one reporter who thought that something was off and wanted to do his due diligence just to make sure. If you had to guess which reporter it was, and you know reporters pretty well that cover the NFL, your first guess is probably right, because it's one of the most prominent reporters of all time in this sport. None other than the legendary Paul Zimmerman, or Dr. Z. By this point in his career, he was working for the New York Post, and he was there on assignment at the Super Bowl. Now, one of the number one rules of journalism is that you are not the story. You are there to report on what's happening. You, the writer, are not the story. However, at Super Bowl IX, Zimmerman was part of the story, though not because he wanted to be. Zimmerman and the reporters did boxes for the games, or Super Bowl squares as some people call them, and the pool contained $106. Zimmerman was in charge of holding onto the money to give to the reporters who won after the game, and $106 was a fairly significant sum of money back then. In the end, though, none of the reporters got their money, because 3 reporters had their wallets stolen in the locker room, including Zimmerman himself. Security was not exactly tight at this Super Bowl, with fans jumping the fence so they could rush the field, fighting with riot police in the process. In case you haven't been able to figure out by now, Super Bowl IX was sort of a disaster, but that's neither here nor there. Anyways, after Zimmerman was looking at the box score for the game and the final stats that came in, he thought that something wasn't right. Zimmerman keeps meticulous notes for every single game, charting every single play so he has it as a reference for his story. And he thought to himself, wait a second, there's no way that the Vikings actually averaged over a yard per carry. They had to do worse than that. So he double-checked everything, and double-checked every play that he charted, thinking that maybe the NFL missed something and that his eyes were not deceiving him. Finally, after double and triple checking his charts and seeing what the NFL said, even though he was clearly not in the right state of mind seeing as his wallet got stolen, he knew it. He was right. The Vikings actually did worse than the 21 yards that the NFL initially had them at. In actuality, the NFL missed a carry, and it should have been 21 rushing attempts, not 20. And that carry in question went for a loss of 4 yards, and it should have been 17 rushing yards, not 21. This meant that instead of the Vikings averaging 1.05 yards per carry, it was just 0.81 yards per carry. That was it. So Zimmerman spoke to the NFL, and 6 hours after the game ended, as writers were finishing up their stories at 11:30 at night, an announcement was made over the loudspeaker. The Vikings stats had been adjusted. It wasn't 21 yards on 20 carries. It was 17 yards on 21 carries. This meant that, considering how late in the night it was, a lot of papers on the West Coast had a completely different stat line than papers on the East Coast, because the East Coast had no time to adjust. It was 12:30 in the morning on the East Coast, and the paper had to be ready to print by that point. Just a bizarre set of circumstances where no one at the NFL caught this, and only hours after the game, thanks to one reporter and one reporter only, did the league realize that they completely screwed up the stats. Now, whether we go with the original number of 21 rushing yards or the revised number of 17 rushing yards, today this is no longer a record for fewest rushing yards allowed in a Super Bowl. 1 decade later, at Super Bowl 20, held between the Chicago Bears and the New England Patriots, in this scene right here, the Bears won 46-10, and did it with a great defense which held the Patriots to just 7 rushing yards. So either way, whether you go with the original number or the revised number, this is no longer the record, so in the grand scheme of things, this really meant nothing. This stat change of 4 yards meant absolutely nothing in the record books, in Vegas, anything like that. But still, imagine if something like this happened today. especially with the partnerships that the league has with sportsbooks and everything that happens with Vegas prop bets. It would be a very interesting situation, to say the least. Just to recap, the Vikings had the worst rushing performance by any team in Super Bowl history, and a few hours after the game, a meticulous, detail-oriented reporter working by himself, not for the NFL, does some calculations on his own accord, and says, scratch that. However bad you initially thought it was actually worse than that. And the NFL says, oh crap, you're right. We made a massive mistake. Let's fix that. A weird situation no matter how you want to slice it for what was, without a doubt, a very weird Super Bowl in a lot of ways. But whether you go with the original number of 21 yards or the revised number of 17 yards, either way, it was undeniable. At this Super Bowl, when it came to running the ball, the Vikings were anything but super. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.